Imagine walking down a cold, quiet street and suddenly locking eyes with someone from your past. Someone who once shaped your life, but now they're unrecognizable, lost, forgotten, struggling to survive. That's exactly what happened to Barron Trump on a freezing night in Denver. The man who once inspired him was now at rock bottom. What happened next will leave you speechless and might just restore your faith in second chances. Stay with me. This story will touch your heart in ways you never expected. The night air in Denver, Colorado was bitterly cold, carrying the sharp bite of an early winter. Storefronts and sidewalks shimmered under a thin layer of frost, and wisps of breath curled into the night sky with every exhale. Barron Trump, wrapped in a dark overcoat, pulled his collar up against the chill as he moved quickly through the dimly lit streets. It was supposed to be a quick walk, just a detour through Larimer Square, but something, or perhaps fate itself, caught his attention. Under the flickering glow of a street lamp, a lone figure sat hunched over on the sidewalk, his shoulders drawn inward as if trying to disappear into the cold. Layers of worn, mismatched clothing barely shielded him from the freezing night. In his trembling hands he held a cardboard sign, its edges soft from wear. The message, written in shaky, uneven handwriting, was heartbreakingly simple. Hard times, anything helps. Barron slowed his pace. Something about the man nagged at him. There was a vague familiarity in the way he held himself, the way his hands curled around the edges of the sign, as if grasping onto the last shred of his dignity. But it wasn't until Barron stepped closer, just enough to see the man's weathered, hollowed-out face, that realization struck him like a punch to the gut. It was Mr. Calloway. For a moment, the noise of the city faded, the cars, the distant laughter from a nearby bar, the hum of street lamps. It all blurred into silence. Years ago, Jonathan Calloway wasn't just a teacher. He was a force of nature. At Brighton Academy, his classroom wasn't just a place where students learned about literature. It was a stage, a battlefield, a grand adventure. He made Shakespeare feel like a thriller, turned ancient poetry into secrets waiting to be uncovered, and somehow made every student, no matter how unsure of themselves, believe they had something important to say. For Barron Trump, Calloway's class had been more than just a subject. It was a refuge, a place where, for once, he wasn't Trump's kid. He was just Barron, a student with ideas that mattered. Calloway's encouragement had shaped him in ways he hadn't even realized at the time. And now, that brilliant, passionate man was sitting on a street corner, lost in the cold, wrapped in rags instead of words. "Mr. Calloway?" His voice was barely more than a whisper, but it carried a weight he hadn't expected. The man flinched at the sound of his own name, as if he hadn't heard it in years. Slowly, bloodshot eyes lifted, scanning Barron's face with a mix of confusion and exhaustion. Then, for the briefest moment, something flickered. A shadow of recognition cutting through the haze of hardship. "Barron?" Calloway's voice was rough, cracked from cold and time. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The years between them hung heavy, a chasm carved by fate, circumstance, and whatever had led Calloway to this place. Barron's mind raced. How did this happen? How did the man who once commanded a classroom with energy and fire end up here, forgotten and broken? What happened to you?" Barron finally asked, his breath curling into the cold night air. Calloway hesitated, his gaze dropping to the pavement. "Shame, regret." The words sat in his throat, unspoken, but Barron could feel them. "I didn't think anyone would recognize me anymore," Calloway whispered, his voice carrying more pain than any story he had ever told. And just like that, Barron knew he couldn't walk away. Mr. Calloway shook his head, eyes darting to the ground. His hands fidgeted with the edges of his tattered coat, his posture rigid with shame. "Barron, I don't want to be a burden." His voice was barely above a whisper, cracked and unsure. But Barron wasn't having it. "You're not a burden," he said firmly, locking eyes with his former teacher. "You were there for me when I needed it. Now, let me do the same for you." The words hung in the cold night air, thick with meaning. Mr. Calloway hesitated, his pride wrestling with his desperation. Finally, with a slow, reluctant nod, he surrendered. Barron reached down, gripping the older man's arm and helping him to his feet. It was unsettling. Calloway had once been a man who carried himself with such confidence, and now he felt fragile, hollow. But Barron held steady. They walked toward the car in silence, the only sound the distant hum of traffic and the shuffle of Calloway's worn-out shoes against the pavement. The drive to the small roadside motel on the outskirts of the city was quiet. Every now and then Barron glanced over, watching as Calloway stared out the window, lost in thought. Maybe in disbelief, maybe in shame. At the motel, Barron paid for a warm room, then stopped by a nearby diner for a hot meal. Nothing fancy, just a steaming bowl of soup and a sandwich. It was the first real food Calloway had likely had in days. As the older man ate, slowly at first, then with more urgency, Barron set down a bag of essentials: clean clothes, basic toiletries, a new pair of socks. Calloway paused, looking at the items, his expression unreadable. "Thank you." The words were soft, strained, but sincere. Barron gave a small nod, but he knew better than to think this was the end of the road. This wasn't a one-night fix. This was only the beginning. Because the real battle wasn't just getting Calloway out of the cold, it was pulling him out of the cycle that had buried him here in the first place. What would you do if you saw someone from your past struggling like Mr. Calloway? Would you step in to help? Drop a comment below. Barron sat at the small motel desk, his laptop open, fingers flying over the keyboard as he searched for resources. Shelters, employment programs, housing assistance, anything that could help get Mr. Calloway back on his feet. But every road led to the same frustrating reality. Without proper identification, he was trapped. No housing, no job, no access to basic services. Barron gritted his teeth, pressing his phone tighter against his ear as he spoke to a Denver outreach center. "Why is it so hard for people to get back on their feet once they fall?" he muttered, frustration bleeding into his voice. On the other end, the woman sighed, a weary, knowing sound that told him she had heard this question too many times before. "Because the system isn't built to lift people up," she said. "It's built to keep them from falling in the first place. But once they do, climbing back out is near impossible. Unless someone like you steps in." Barron exhaled. He hated how right she was. But if the system wouldn't help, he would. That night, Barron sat in his car, staring at the glow of his phone screen. Social media had never been his thing, but this wasn't about him. This was about Mr. Calloway. With a deep breath, he started typing. "A few years ago, there was a teacher who changed my life. He made words come alive, made me believe in myself when I felt invisible. Today, I found him homeless on the streets of Denver. This man gave so much to his students, and now he needs help. If he ever impacted your life, or if you believe in second chances, please share this story. Let's get him back on his feet." He attached a photo, a simple shot of Calloway bundled in a clean hoodie staring out of the motel window, lost in thought. Then he hit post. Within hours, comments flooded in. Former students, old colleagues, even strangers from across the country began sharing memories of how Calloway had changed their lives. He was the reason I became a writer. Best teacher I ever had. Tell him he's not forgotten. I wish more people helped their teachers like this. Offers started trickling in, small donations, job leads, even an old friend from the university willing to help navigate the paperwork for an ID. But not everyone saw it that way. The critics came fast and loud. Rich kid playing hero. Why just one man? What about all the others? If he's homeless, he must have done something to deserve it. Barron felt the sting of those words. He could have ignored it, but the only opinion that mattered was Mr. Calloway's. And right now, the hardest battle wasn't against the system or the skeptics. It was convincing Mr. Calloway that he still had something left to give. Weeks of effort finally started to pay off. With Barron's help, a nonprofit secured Mr. Calloway a new ID, opening the door to basic services. Therapy sessions gave him the space to confront the trauma of losing everything. Slowly, the weight of his past began to lift. But the real turning point came when Barron encouraged him to start tutoring students at a local library. At first, Calloway resisted. "Who would want to learn from someone like me?" he muttered. But the moment he stepped in front of a small group of students, something clicked. The hesitation faded. The old spark returned. He wasn't just reading words, he was bringing them to life, just like he used to. One evening, as they sat in Barron's apartment, sifting through job listings, Calloway hesitated before asking, "Do you think I could ever teach again?" Barron didn't miss a beat. "Why not? You were born to teach." That was all Calloway needed to hear. Getting back into a formal teaching role wasn't easy. His resume had gaps, his confidence wavered. But with persistence, Barron helped him land a part-time creative writing position at a local community center. The first time he stepped in front of a real classroom again, he wasn't just a teacher. He was a man reclaiming his purpose. Months later, the auditorium buzzed with anticipation as Mr. Calloway stepped onto the stage. A mix of students, parents, and community members filled the seats, waiting to hear his story. Taking a deep breath, he faced the crowd. For years, he had felt invisible. Tonight, all eyes were on him. "I thought my story was over," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "But I've learned that no matter how dark a chapter may be, it's never too late to rewrite the ending." The room erupted in applause, not out of sympathy, but out of respect. In the back, Barron watched, a lump forming in his throat. The man who had once inspired him, who had once lifted him up, was finally standing tall again. After the event, Calloway found Barron, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," he said softly. Barron shook his head with a smile. "You already did. Years ago in your classroom, this was the least I could do." Mr. Calloway's story reminds us that no one is beyond redemption. A single act of kindness can change a life, and sometimes even our own. We all have the power to help, whether it's offering support, encouragement, or simply seeing someone who feels invisible. Now I want to hear from you. Has someone ever made a difference in your life? Share your story in the comments. And if this video moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Let's spread the message of kindness together.